Welcome everybody to the second part of this three-part gardening series called Plant Reproduction. My name is Ray Kruse, Food Systems Program Coordinator and Master Gardener Coordinator right here at the ISU Extension Outreach Office of Dubuque County. Now, plant reproduction is one of my favorite things to learn about and favorite things to do in the garden, and I hope you find it just as entertaining. But before we dig into this kit today, I want to thank our funding sources. And if you're in Dubuque County, you can thank your local ISU Extension Outreach Office right here in Dubuque County. I would also like to thank our collaborating partners for helping us to bring these kits to you today. And that would be local nonprofits and local libraries. If you're outside of Dubuque County, I would also like to thank our other collaborating partners for funding and providing this kit to you, and you'll know based on how this kit's presented to you. So I hope you have fun and enjoy learning about plant reproduction. Welcome to our first activity in this plant reproduction kit. What we're going to talk about is reproducing plants by seeds. Now you might be like, Ray, I already saved my seeds for my tomatoes or my beans every year. This is going to be boring, right? Well, something I did want to inform you about is that some seeds actually need certain environmental cues in order to start growing or sprout. And that's what we're going to talk about here with some seeds that I've included in this kit. Now, if we grab out our gallon Ziploc baggie here of plant material, which is our large baggie, inside there we will find another quart Ziploc baggie. And inside that quart Ziploc baggie, we will find a wet paper towel to help the acorns retain moisture. And you will find a pair of red oak tree acorns. Now, you might be like, well, Ray, this is simple. We just go collect the acorns and plant them out next spring. We'll have a tree, right? Well, not quite. Red oak acorns actually need a process of stratification to trigger them into thinking that they have gone through a winter. And you can achieve that by sticking them in an environment that is between 32 and 41 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 to 45 days. And a prime example of a place that would provide those types of conditions would be a refrigerator. Now, just so you know, before you go sticking this bag of acorns into your refrigerator, that these acorns here were collected from a park and could have been around the feces of a squirrel or a dog or something like that. So if food safety is a concern, you can actually go outside and plant these outside in the soil, about an inch deep. And if you're worried about your little furry neighbors called the squirrels coming to dig them up, you can cover them with a piece of hardware cloth so that they can't access them in the next spring when they do sprout. That you can take that off and you'll have yourself some little red oak tree sprouts or little red oak tree babies. Now, there are a couple other things I do want to talk to you about or mention, that these acorns here have been sorted or processed so that they hopefully do not have any nut-consuming insects inside them. So that's commonly something that we'll see with acorns if little kids bring them inside, is we'll see these little worms that will come out of the acorns. What I did is I floated them in a bucket of water, and the floated acorns are the ones that are hollow inside and most likely have some sort of insect in them. So I've taken those off and discarded those. And these are the sinkers, and the sinkers are ones that are supposed to or have a good chance of being intact and not full of worms. And so that's something also to think about too before you go sticking this in your food refrigerator, whether you actually want to find worms in there or not. But if you have another refrigerator that you have that you use part of the year or something like that, you could easily stick them in there, and this is going to meet those requirements, and you can go and plant them. And once they've met their stratification requirements, to trigger them to start growing. Now, when it comes to acorns or other seeds too, another thing that some other seeds might require is fire. So some prairie seeds require fire in order to trigger them to start growing. Some seeds require light. Some seeds require heat. And it's all dependent on the plant. And this is just one example, and this is a process of stratification that we would use with a red oak tree. So I'll have you join me right back here for the next activity. Welcome back. As part of the staff at the Extension office here, I get a lot of questions about troublesome weeds that are in gardens and lawns. And we're going to talk about today about some of the common weeds that are really difficult to control in those areas. First, what we're going to do is we're going to go to our kit. We're going to pull out our quart Ziploc baggie here that has a long, wiry plant inside. When we pull out this long, wiry plant, what we're looking at here is quackgrass. Now, Quackgrass is really competitive because it grows via these underground wiry rhizomes. And everything that is in my hands that is white here, which is basically below where my fingers are holding the plant, is what you would see underneath the ground. And everything that's green is what you would see above ground. So you can see that there's just so much more going on beneath the ground than what you might see above the ground. And that is what lends to how competitive this is. Because if you imagine going out to your garden and be like, I got a few weeds, you'll just pluck those off, and take those right off and think that you did some good work today and taking care of some quackgrass. But really, what you have is all of this underground rhizome system underneath that is still growing and able to send out new shoots and continue life as normal. You didn't really hurt it too much. Now you might be like, well, you know what, I can just go through and take my tiller and run that through the garden and just chop it all up. And that's okay, but what our tiller will end up doing with its sharp blades is just chopping it up into a bunch of small individual pieces. And I encourage you to do this with your own scissors at your own location as to where you're at. And if you imagine this being what your tiller did to this quackgrass in the soil in your garden, what you're going to end up with is a bunch of little pieces of rhizome. And the unique thing about these little pieces of rhizome is if you see a dark spot with little thread-like actual roots, so those are the actual roots. The rhizome is the long, wiry, white-like root that's got some structure to it. And the thread-like things are actually the individual roots. And if you have a spot where those roots attach to the rhizome, that's called a node. And if you have one node, that's all it takes for you to have more quackgrass grow. So you can imagine that one quackgrass plant that I just had turned into a whole bunch of little quackgrass plants. And that's why it's so hard to control this type of a weed. And it's a perennial, so it comes back year after year after year. Now we're going to shift our attention to another common garden weed that's really difficult to control. What we're going to do is we're going to go to our gallon sack and we're going to pull out another long, wiry-like grass plant. And you might recognize this here as something that is commonly known as crabgrass. Some folks might also know it as watergrass in the Dubuque area. And this is actually an annual weed. This grass comes back year after year from the seeds that come from the heads that are on the crabgrass. And yeah, it's a seeded weed, but also what makes it really competitive is the fact that it has something called a stolon. And that's what all of these individual stems are, is as it grows out of the soil and grows across the lawn, as we mow each time, it continues to encourage this plant to grow out sideways because it can't grow up because we continue mowing it off. So it grows out sideways, and as it does that, it grows roots that shoot out from the stem down into the soil. And you can see that if you tear off or look at your individual stolon there that you have, you can see individual roots poking up from there, and those are actually what's growing down into the soil in your lawn, and that adds to the competitiveness of this weed. Now you might be like, you know what? I'm going to look at go to the weed in the lawn and take out the center. So you rip this out. And I'm just going to use the scissors as an example for this. So you rip that off and take out the center of that weed. But what you left behind on those individual stems is they're still able to access water and nutrients because they have still individual roots that were able to go down into the soil. And so each one of these individual branches on that crabgrass is an individual plant now, as opposed to just one plant. And that's what's so difficult about trying to control crabgrass, because it reproduces via really small seeds, and then trying to pull it all up from the soil is really hard because it's got all these little roots that root down into the soil, and this is called a stolon. So the point of this exercise was not only to show you two common garden weeds and how they reproduce, but also contrast the difference between a stolon, which grows roots down into the soil, and a rhizome, which has underground plant material that shoots plants up out of the soil. So we'll talk about rhizomes going further into this activity. Welcome back, and we're going to turn our attention to a plant that's considered sterile because it doesn't really reproduce by seeds, but it does reproduce by two different forms of tissue propagation or reproduction. So that's what we're going to look at here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of our kit here. We're going to pull out our large bag of plant material, our potting mix, our small bag of plant material, and our recycled yogurt containers. So looking at our small bag of plant material, you should have one thing left in there. And this is a rhizome of a decorative grass called Miscanthus giganteus. Now, we talked about rhizomes and how quackgrass can reproduce by rhizomes. This is the same exact root structure we're looking at right here. Now, what we're going to talk a little bit more about too is the history, or so a little bit more background on Miscanthus. And Miscanthus is a decorative grass that can grow 8 to 10 feet tall. This is a 4-foot section of an exterior stem on my own grass at my own farm. Right now the interior sections are anywhere between 6 and 8 feet, and I hope for them to get anywhere between 8 to 10 feet on the normal year. So yeah, beautiful ornamental grass. Is also a clump grass or a bunch type grass. It doesn't spread very well underneath the ground and become very invasive. So that's just a little bit of background about Miscanthus. Now, what you might be familiar with when reproducing or splitting or dividing some of your landscape perennials or things like that is you might have a series of underground reproductive structures in splits or something like that, from a hosta or a daylily or an ornamental grass such as this. But really, what you actually need is just one individual bud that is inside that clump. You don't need the entire clump, but what's inside of that entire clump is a whole bunch of those little buds, and when they're all transplanted together, gives us a good chance of having success being transplanted into our own garden. It's also easier, you don't have to wash it off and things like that, but in theory, all you really need is one individual bud, and that's what this Miscanthus rhizome section is here for you to observe and watch it grow. So I'm going to help you identify what the actual bud is on that rhizome that you need in order to have it be successfully grown in your house. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a yogurt container here and set that off to the side, and we're going to trim back this Miscanthus rhizome so that it fits inside that cup. Now this cup's a little small, but we're trying to recycle and be green, so that's why we've included that here today. But what we actually need when planting our Miscanthus rhizome is an individual bud. And normally the buds are the pointed tips that are surrounded by a purplish coating or covering on the tip itself. So we have some other tips here that were damaged in the excavation process just because this grass is so hard to deal with. It's easy to damage a lot of those rhizomes, but we have one bud left, and that's what we really need. So I'm going to actually prune off some of these old buds here so that it fits inside of our yogurt container. And to do that, you're going to need a very heavy-duty scissors or a pruners. And so I'm just going to prune back that old piece of rhizome there. Now this will fit very nicely in there. I'm going to prune off some of those exterior roots. And the exterior, or the roots, so we talked about the rhizome being this woody portion here, and that's what the rhizome is, and the root is actually this piece that's very, you can move it with your fingers. And we're going to cut those roots back so that they fit inside the cup as well and don't stick out the top when we stick it in the yogurt container. What I'm also going to do too is trim back the stem just a little bit as well, just so that it's not sticking out as far. And there we have it. We have a very nice Miscanthus rhizome that will fit inside that yogurt cup. And if possible, you can't do it inside this cup, but if possible, if your rhizome, you're able to point the tip up, that's nice, but if not, that's okay. We'll just point it sideways and it'll have to figure its way out of there. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to plant our Miscanthus rhizome. I'm going to fill the yogurt container half full of potting mix. And based on your Miscanthus rhizome, you might have to do this differently. You might have to stick no soil in and just stick the rhizome in and then stick a potting mix in. Or if you're able to just stick it into the soil, you'll have to figure that out. But our goal is to get that rhizome back underneath the potting mix so that it can continue growing. There we have it. And so now I've leveled off and tamped down that potting mix, and we've now planted our Miscanthus rhizome, and we can watch that grow. Now, like I mentioned, this Miscanthus grass can grow a huge, huge stem. Like I said, right now they're between 6 and 8 feet in my own garden. By the end of the season, they'll be about 8 to 10 feet tall, which is why a lot of universities are using this grass in a lot of experiments to study biomass production for alternative energy. But anyway, this stem isn't just large, but it also contains some very interesting reproductive structures that we can isolate and also reproduce this grass by, and not just by rhizomes. So if we go to our large plant material bag, in there you'll find 2 what look like twigs, but they're actually Miscanthus stems. And on the Miscanthus stem, if we take that individual stem and peel back the sheath of that stem. So the sheath is what actually attaches to the leaf of the Miscanthus, but we'll pull that back and reveal just a bare stem. And on that bare stem, if you rotate the node where that sheath connects to the stem, if you rotate that, you'll find a little itty bitty dot right there, and that is a reproductive structure as well. You'll be able to grow more Miscanthus from that. And so what we're going to do here is on either side of that node, we're going to cut 3/4 to 1 inch away from that node and cut away the internode. And I'll show that here on the next piece, but we're just looking for something that's between 1.5 inches and 2 inches, something big enough to, or small enough to just fit inside that yogurt container. And based on your sample of stems that you have, you might have between 3 and 4 nodes. But here's another stem of the Miscanthus, and the internode is what we're throwing away. So here is a node, and the space here doesn't really contain any reproductive structure, so that's what we're throwing away. So again, I'm going to cut 3/4 to 1 inch on either side, just so that doesn't fly away on me. Oops. We're going to cut away those nodes. And being that this is a demonstration, things actually happen. I will get that node. Okay, so we have 3 different nodes that came with our stems here. And what we're going to do is we're going to plant these in our second yogurt container. So what I'm going to do is dump in the majority of the potting mix here until we're about 3/4 of an inch away from the top. I'm going to tamp that down and put in my 3 Miscanthus nodes there. And then we'll finish dumping on top the rest of that potting mix. Tamp that down there, and there you have it. We have some Miscanthus reproductive structures, which are stem nodes planted in one container, and we can contrast that with a rhizome planted in the second container. Now, between the 2 propagation methods or reproductive methods, the stem propagation or stem nodes are not quite as successful in growing all the time. So usually in my experience, I have anywhere from, 25 to 50% of those actually grow. So we hope to get something to grow out of those nodes. Now, out of this individual rhizome here, we're anywhere between 80 to 100% success. So between those 2, if you have a plant grow out of either of those, you can contrast in how they grow differently out of the same, with material from the same plant. They're just completely different plant structures. So with that, I will clean right up here, and I'll have you meet me right back. We've spent a lot of time talking about nodes today, whether it's the above ground portion of our Miscanthus that we planted in the soil, or some below ground rhizomes that we planted. We talked a lot about those nodes, and now we're going to focus on some structures that look just a little bit different than those nodes. We're going to go to our gallon Ziploc baggie, and we're going to pull out our potato. Now, you might be familiar with the idea that when we plant potatoes in the ground, we plant another piece of potato. And we're reproducing them by cutting them apart commonly. And the reason why you're like, well, obviously we're trying to make more hills of potatoes out of one. But you might not know exactly what's all going on in that process of trying to cut them apart and why we do that. It's not only just to make more hills. So if we look at our potato here, we have a lot of eyes concentrated at the far end of the potato here. At the other end of the potato, where the eyes are not concentrated, you'll commonly see the scar where that potato was connected to the original plant. What we're going to do here is we're going to take our knife and we're going to slice down vertically through that. We're going to start at the concentrated eye end, and we're going to slice all the way down through that potato. to that scar. Oh, that's beautiful. So looking inside, what we're going to see here is obviously the white area of the potato here that's more whitish or creamy, but we're going to see more of like a clearish or glassy like structure in the center, and that is the medulla or the pith. And you'll notice if you happen to cut through an eye on your potato that medulla or pith actually connects to the eye as well as other eyes that you may have cut through on your potato. And what that is like the internet. Each one of those eyes are connected on that potato, and when we're slicing this potato apart, we're breaking that internet connection. And what they're doing is obviously they're communicating, but what they're communicating about is that when they're all connected and they're planted in the ground, where all the buds are concentrated at the one end of the potato, those are the apical buds, and those buds are going to be the first ones to sprout up out of the ground. So there might be, 10 different eyes on this potato here, and the eyes that are concentrated at the apical end are going to be the first ones to grow. And by splitting them apart, we're breaking that internet connection so that now more eyes are encouraged to grow at one time. Now, when we cut our potatoes up, there is a point in time where we're going to want to stop. Typically, we're at least going to want to make sure that we have one eye on each piece. So for example, here's the end of the potato here that has all those eyes concentrated. There's not as many eyes over here. But if we were to slice this up once more, we're going to want to at least make sure that we have one eye on that piece. That's all you necessarily need. Now, as a preference as a gardener, I prefer two. So I'm going to slice it this way. And on this end, we have the two eyes here. In this, we probably have 5, and that's okay. We could continue cutting this down, and in theory, each one of those eyes are going to generate another potato plant. But if we slice this off too thin and take off one individual little eye here, in theory, that's going to grow, but there's not a lot of potato there to provide it much energy to get it up out of the ground so that we get a potato plant to grow. And that's where we have to eventually stop and cut our losses, because we need at least some food there for those eyes to pull off of and get up out of the ground so that we can get some potato plants growing. I typically like to stop cutting when they get down to about 1.5 ounces to 2 ounces a piece. And so yeah, that's a good example there. We'll cut this one up. There, so we got a good 4 hills. Each one of them has at least 2 eyes. Like I said, that's my preference. In theory, you only need 1, but that's how we would propagate our potatoes here and why we do so. We break that apical dominance so that we encourage more eyes to grow at one time. Now, if we stressed our potatoes out in storage or something like that, the internet connection that's between all those eyes isn't quite as strong, and more of those eyes might grow at one time. So there is some competing theories as to why that might be falsified. But for a healthy potato being planted in the garden, only those apical buds are typically going to grow. And you would see that too on a potato that you may not split but is super small. So this is a 2-ounce piece already, and a lot of potato growers don't even bother cutting their potatoes if they're small enough already, which is what I honestly prefer to do, because I don't have this cut area of the potato here that's exposed to disease and insects in the ground. If you are cutting your potatoes prior to sticking them in the ground, I would recommend callousing them up prior to getting them in the ground. You can just do that by setting them with the cut side up on your countertop in your kitchen or wherever, and letting them sit there for 3 days to almost a week, so that that becomes calloused and dry and reduces your chance of having disease once getting them planted into the ground. But if you have a potato that's already 2 ounces or 1.5 ounces already in size, there's really no need to necessarily split them if you don't want to, because you already have a seed piece. Now, like I said, there's probably another 10 eyes on this potato. Only the apical ones are going to grow. So hopefully you learned a little bit about propagating potatoes here, and we're going to focus on another activity when we come back. As part of our last activity, we're going to look at something that we typically don't think of reproducing, and that is bulbs. Inside of our kit here, we will find our large plant material bag, and we'll get our last piece of plant material out, and that is a crocus bulb. Now, a little bit about crocuses is that they are not actually a true bulb. They are something called a corm, and we're going to find out why in just a second here. But first, we're going to dissect this bulb. And we're going to have the bud end here that grows up into the flower next year. We're also going to have the rooted end, and now yours might have a scar there, like this one does, where it's really nice and flat, or it might have some leftover roots from being out in where it was growing this past year. Doesn't make any difference, but we're going to slice through it vertically on this corm here. Now, looking at the inside of our crocus bulb here, we're going to see a very solid mass in the center. It's really white and solid, and it doesn't have any layers. And that's what makes this a corm and not a true bulb. A true bulb has layers, kind of like an onion, and an example of that would be daffodils or tulips. Both of those are true bulbs. If this isn't a true bulb, this is called a corm. And like I said, this is a crocus bulb, but another thing that is also a corm is a gladiolus. And gladioluses also have a solid interior and reproduce the same way, at which we're going to talk about here in a second. And like I said, these are corms, and how they reproduce is in their perennial nature. What they'll do is, this was a corm or storage structure of energy that was formed this year in the soil. It was dug up, and we're going to plant it next year. And what it's going to do is it is going to stack another corm right on top of the old. So we're going to take the other half of our corm bulb here and hold it on top of the other for representation. Just a second here, let me pull off that exterior covering there so I can hold it. So we have this year's growth at the bottom of the corm here, and we have next year's corm on top that's going to be grown as part of the energy collection of next year's leaves. Now, where the reproduction on a corm occurs is between the two corms. They will actually form little baby corms called cormels, and if you see those on there, you could break those off, and they're going to be really tiny, and you could replant those and grow those up into more crocuses. Now, we typically don't grow or dig up our crocuses and try and reproduce them, just because this isn't quite the area to be redoing or to do that. But something that we do corm reproduction with, or commonly see this with, is gladiolus bulbs. You might dig them up in the fall and find the old corm at the bottom, find a bunch of little cormels also on the bottom around the base of that bulb that you're now digging up out of the ground. So that's a prime example of how one specific type of bulb actually reproduces. So with that, I'll have you join me right back here for the wrap-up. Before I let you go, I want to review what we learned today. We started out with our red oak tree acorns and learning that some seeds need certain environmental parameters to trigger those seeds to sprout. And that's what we did with the stratification on our acorns. After that, we learned about two tricky weeds in our gardens or lawns that reproduce very easily, even without seeds. And that is the quackgrass, which can reproduce via underground rhizomes, or our crabgrass, which reproduces via over-the-ground stolons that creep across the soil. After that, we shifted our attention to an ornamental grass and looked at rhizome propagation and also stem propagation, and hopefully you have some plants grow out of them. After that, we focused on some potatoes and why we would want to split them up before planting them to break apical dominance and encourage more buds to sprout. After that, we learned about how one certain type of bulb, which isn't actually a true bulb but rather a corm, and how they reproduce in our garden. So I hope you learned something today. This is Ray Kruse, your Food Systems Program Coordinator and Master Gardener Coordinator right here in Dubuque County. Happy growing, everybody.